Welcome everyone to this IFST webinar, Our Daily Bread. My name's Kate Halliwell. I'm going to be your chair for this session. My day job, I'm the Chief Scientist at the Food and Drink Federation. I'm also chair of IFST's Food Science and Nutrition Special Interest Group, and we're the people who brought you this webinar today. So this year, IFST is celebrating its diamond anniversary, and that got a few of us to chatting about common foodstuffs. So things that you think of that are a constant and how they might actually have changed over the last 60-ish years. And that's whether how they've been processed, our nutrition understanding of that food, or simply what it is that we buy when we all go shopping. And what's more basic than bread? We probably all have favourites, hot buttered toast, chewy ciabatta, crunchy French sticks. It's a product that on the one hand can be seen as so simple. Everywhere in the world will eat it. Many of us, in fact, decided we would bake our own during COVID lockdowns. On the other hand, it's a foodstuff that we have seen huge changes in. The variety of products that we buy, and of course, that fundamental shift that the introduction of the Chorleywood process brought back in the early 60s. It's also seen as something that can be an everyday staple, a healthy choice. And yet more recently, it might be something that some people are a bit wary of, whether that's bloating or avoiding carbs. So to guide us through all of this, to sort the wheat from the chaff, if you will, we have got two brilliant speakers today. Nikki Gillette, who is the Nutrition and Sustainability Manager at Allied Bakery and also a member of Federation of Bakers, and Martin Whitworth, who's Principal Scientist at Camden BRI. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through their bios, but you can find them all on the IFST webpage for this event. Before I hand over to them though, I just have a few bits of info about this morning's session. So the webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded to IFST's webinar hub. Each speaker is going to present for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we're going to have a Q&A session after both presentations. And we will try to get through as many of your questions as possible. So please feel free to make comments and ask questions throughout the presentations using the Q&A button, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. If you really like someone else's question and you want to make sure that one gets asked, then you can upvote that by pressing the like button, which is next to their question. And we will try to get through as many people's questions as we can. So please do have your thinking hats on of what you would like to ask as we go through the presentations. So without further ado, I am going to hand you over to our first speaker, Nikki.
Hi, Kate. Thank you for that. Let me do the exciting thing and share the slides. So let's just do that. Oh, now that worked so well when we were trying earlier. I'm just going to try again. Have you stopped sharing, Kate? Because I can't share at the moment.
Yeah, it was through IFST.
That's just, no, it's not coming up as an option. That looks better. There we go. Right. Are we on?
Yeah.
Good, thank you. Right. Well, thank you for the introduction and sorry for the technical delay. I want to take you on a journey, traveling back 60 years to look at what was happening in the UK and to see how our daily bread has changed over that time. I am just going to make a statement. This is not a personal journey, right? I haven't been in the industry for 60 years, just to say. So here we are back in the 1960s. And I don't know about you, but when I think of the 60s, I always tend to think of the swinging 60s, all miniskirts and Beatles. But the reality is the UK was still recovering from the end of the Second World War. Food rationing didn't finish until the early 1950s. Although bread itself wasn't rationed, they did have the national loaf. This was a dingy brown colour because it was made with a wheat meal flour. It wasn't until 1953 that controls on the milling of white flour were lifted. And interestingly, this is when B vitamins and iron were required to be added to non-wholemeal wheat flours. And that was following calcium, which had been introduced back in 1942. Personally, I think the strong performance we see of white bread at this time was very much a reaction against that wartime diet, a real visual signal of the end of that difficult period. As Kate mentioned, one big change in the 60s was the introduction of the Chorleywood bread process, named after Chorleywood, the place in Hertfordshire, by the way. This kept the same key stages of bread making, so mixing, proving, baking, cooling, but it sped up the mixing process and it enabled bakers to make bread more efficiently. One big benefit was it reduced our reliance on overseas wheat, and that had been such an issue during the war. It was initially intended to help craft bakers, but large-scale bakers were quick to see the benefits, and this is now the main bread-making process in the UK, as well as countries such as Australia, New Zealand, and India. Martin will be telling us much more about this in the next talk. By the 1970s, the economic climate has changed. There's price inflation and strikes. In terms of our diets, the idea of convenience and space foods has taken hold following the moon landings in 1969. Think instant desserts like Angel Delight and powdered mash advertised by aliens. It's interesting to see how willing people were to embrace science and modern processed foods. In the world of bread, we start to see some changes. Wholemeal bread is making an entrance, but it is still mainly associated with hippies and vegetarians, strange folk who don't want white bread. As we enter the 1980s, we see a change in politics. Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979 and would remain in power until 1990. This was the age of consumerism, and with foreign travel becoming more commonplace, we start to see more exotic bread on the shelves, such as ciabatta and focaccia. From a health perspective, interest in fibre started to grow, largely due to the work of Dennis Burkitt, a surgeon who had worked in Africa. He observed that many diseases common in Western countries were rare in African populations consuming high fibre diets. He proposed that low fibre diets were linked to non-communicable diseases such as coronary heart disease, diabetes, obesity, colorectal cancer. His hypothesis spurred extensive research and public health campaigns in the UK, leading to an increased awareness of the benefits of fibre. This shift influenced dietary guidelines to promote higher intakes through whole grains, fruits, vegetables, and legumes. But the idea of eating more fibre was really popularised by the publication of the F-Plan Diet by Audrey Eighton, who was a journalist, writer, and animal welfare campaigner. It was published in 1982 and became a global bestseller. The diet recommends consuming 35 to 50 grams of fibre per day, primarily from unrefined cereal foods, fruits and veg. And this had a huge influence on the general public, and we saw noticeable increases in the sales of wholemeal bread at that time. However, the taste of wholemeal wasn't for everyone, and bakers were keen to find something to encourage white bread eaters, and particularly children, to try higher fibre varieties. Mighty White was the first soft grain bread, a white loaf with added pre-softened grains of rye and wheat. The concept first launched in Australia and then was brought to the UK in 1986. As we enter the 90s, we see the rise of the internet, economic stability, and a greater focus on cultural diversity. There's an increased focus on health, and in bakery, the trend for wholemeal bread is stable, but seeded breads are starting to grow as people enjoy the extra taste and texture. Coming into the year 2000, there's a mix of both technological advancements and increasing environmental awareness. From a health perspective, the rise in obesity could not be ignored. Back in the 60s, we were looking at 5% of the population, whereas by the 2000s, we're at 23%. The Atkins diet, created by Dr. Robert Atkins in the 1960s, is probably the best known low-carb diet. Although his associated book was first published in 1972, this diet gained widespread popularity in the early 2000s. It challenged the traditional high-carbohydrate, low-fat dietary approach that was widely recommended at the time, and it led to the introduction of low-carb breads and snacks. However, the diet did also face criticism from health professionals due to the concerns about its high saturated fat content and potential long-term health risks. It's hard to directly attribute its sales to trends, but we see bread consumption drop further in this decade to around 2 slices a day. We also see the topic of whole grains come to the fore. Wholemeal bread is now accounting for 20% of the market. For those not so keen on the taste and texture of wholemeal, whole grain and white breads launched in this decade. Baked with a blend of white and wholemeal flour, this would prove a good way to encourage white bread eaters to include some whole grains in their diet. Although the first work on salt reduction in bread started in the 1980s, it was the publication of the Coma report, Nutritional Aspects of Cardiovascular Disease, in 1994, which looked at the causal relationship between salt intake and blood pressure. It recommended that intake should be reduced gradually from 9 grams a day to 6 grams. This target wasn't formally adopted until 2001, when it was included in the Chief Medical Officer annual report. The Food Standards Agency would go on to raise consumer awareness with their Sid the Slug campaign and to set voluntary salt reduction targets for the food industry, covering 85 categories of food, which were due to be met by 2010. Of course, that was just the start of the journey. Across the industry, we have continued to work towards revised targets, and we're currently waiting for the final results of the 2024 salt targets to be published. Over and above flavour, salt plays an important technical role in bread making. It controls yeast fermentation, it strengthens the gluten, and it controls the starch gelatinization temperature. Reducing salt can lead to sticky doughs, particularly in warmer weather. In the final product, salt also plays a role in preservation and retaining moisture in the bread. Despite all this, we've been working hard over the years to reduce salt, and Federation of Bakers members have reduced by over a quarter since 2004. As we move into the 2010s, we're experiencing Brexit, more technology in our lives, but also a rising interest in craft and artisan products. Compared to the 70s, we seem more fearful of science, and there's a yearning for everything to be natural. The amount of bread consumed each day continues to decline. There is more and more variety. Some of this consumption is switching to other bakery products, such as bagels and wraps and croissants. This is the decade where gluten-free breads start to become more mainstream. In fact, this sector trebled in size between 2013 and 2019, reaching 2% share at its peak. Interestingly, while some are trying to reduce gluten, which is a wheat protein, the keto diets are also in vogue, with consumers looking for higher protein foods. Seeded breads also continue to grow, and we see the rise of sourdough and artisan breads bringing more choice to the market. And again, sourdough did give us all something to do during lockdown. At the end of this decade, we see the term ultra-processed food emerge into the wider media. The NOVA definition is the most widely used, although it's hard to say it's the most accurate name, as it focuses more on the ingredients and additives used than the processing. While a lot of the evidence for the impact on our health is observational, it would be wrong to dismiss it. However, decades of science sit behind the current healthy eating guidelines. So for now, it feels right that we concentrate on reducing our intake of foods which are high in fat, salt, and/or sugar. When it comes to bread and other foods that are traditionally recommended as part of a healthy, balanced diet, there's a real concern that the UPF narrative has the potential to drive people away from a healthy source of fiber, protein, and micronutrients. So coming to today, I'll conclude with a few thoughts about how far we've come from the simple white loaf. We have a plethora of choice, from sourdoughs to tiger bread, wholemeal, malted grain and seeded loaves. And for those not ready to commit, the wholemeal and white 50-50 style loaves, as well as plenty of influence from across the seas. There are high fibre and high protein loaves, gluten-free and low carb offerings, as well as the comforting tradition of a sliced white loaf. Looking forward, there are still lots of challenges and areas to explore. Folic acid fortification will be coming our way, but we also need to think about growing our wheat more sustainably, ensuring we all work to reduce food waste, and reducing the environmental impact of the baking process. I think there's an exciting, dynamic future ahead for sliced bread, and who knows where the next 60 years will take us. So thank you for listening. I'm going to hand over to Martin to tell us more about the Chorleywood bread process. So let me just stop sharing and I will hand over to Martin. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me do the technical stuff of sharing my screen. Right, so I hope that's showing now. It tells me it is. So thank you very much, Nikki, for giving us that sort of overview of the market and the sort of public appetite for bread and the sort of styles we've had over the years. I want to focus a little bit more on the technology of how it is produced. Now, Nikki has given us the sort of historical trends. I've picked up sort of what the current situation is. The figures may differ slightly. The source I've got is from UK flour millers, so that they're saying that 60 to 70% of bread is white at the moment. Very popular product. We may not be eating as much as we used to, but most households eat it. And I suppose another thing that's has happened within my memory is we used to buy bread just in multiples of 400 grams, and now we have a lot more flexibility in different sort of sizes that are available to us. And on the right, I thought it's just interesting to see what the price of bread is. This is sort of absolute terms, not real terms, and bread has always been part of the basket of goods that the Office for National Statistics uses to come up with the retail prices index. So 60 years ago, a loaf of bread cost 6p, and now they're saying it's about £1.60 for the equivalent size of product. I've got a bit of a timeline. I'm not going to read them all out for you, and you can sort of see some of the highlights that I've picked out. But I think in terms of 60 years, that pretty much coincides with when the Chorleywood bread process was invented. It was invented in 1961 and was becoming pretty popular by about 1965. So I will talk a little bit about what that process is, but that's certainly within the UK has become the dominant process. Another trend that we've seen is a lot more adoption of homegrown wheats. So you can see there in 1986, it got above 80% for the first time. And there are several drivers of that. Partly the Plant Varieties and Seeds Act meant that breeders started to get royalties for it, so it was more economical. Joining the common market meant that there were then tariffs on overseas wheat. And also there was something we call the Green Revolution, which was a big advances in plant breeding and providing better yields. And I mentioned Norman Borlaug there. He was in America and very much part of that. And it was the Nobel Peace Prize he got because his work helped to feed a lot more of the world's population. I remember sort of early in my career that there was an awful lot of debate going on about the own label bread hitting 7p per loaf, because there was concern that was below cost and that maybe it was a lost leader, and a lot of controversy as to whether that was actually the case. Versus the graph I showed you previously, that one had at about the same date, the average price of a loaf of bread was about 70p, but there were some that actually hit 7p. So I found a report that my colleagues did back in the 60s they'd done a survey and come up with a list of about 19 processes that were used around the world to make white bread. I have summarized just 5 of them, representing perhaps the more popular ones and the ones that were used in the UK. And some of them vary in the principle by which the dough is developed. So sponge and dough and bulk fermentation achieved the development by a long proof process. The Chorleywood bread process was new in that it's achieved the development in the mixer much more quickly with a high-speed, high-power mixer. There was also a process that used chemical development with oxidizing and reducing agents, but that one wasn't used in the UK because of restrictions on the use of the reducing agents. And I've got a few diagrams from that same report and some photos of some of those key processes. So the one at the top we're calling straight dough. This is a bulk fermentation, and you can see in red what the tanks look like that you ferment bread in, and it's still used in some countries, but has been largely superseded in the UK now. And it's a relatively slow process and takes a lot of space for all those doughs proving. Some of the other methods you can also see are relatively slow processes involving long periods of fermentation. And the one at the bottom is the Chorleywood process, and that cuts out a lot of that time by achieving, as I say, the development in the mixer. And you can see a photo there in the blue outline of a Chorleywood bread process mixer. It's a very high-speed, high-power mixer and delivers the work within less than 5 minutes. So you have a much shorter process. I have put on at the bottom, it's not part of the diagram, and it's often something that people neglect to think about, that actually cooling is a very large part of the time in a bread process and takes about 2 hours. So the Chorleywood bread process was invented in 1961 by Norman Chamberlain, Bill Collins, and George Elton at the British Bakeries Institute, British Baking Industries Research Association. I overlapped with Bill Collins for a little while as one of my colleagues at the successor of that organisation, and the key features here are listed. There's a lot of things that people may associate nowadays with it, which are optional ingredients that you might use, but this is the sort of core definition of how they define the process. And the key aspect is the mechanical dough development in less than 5 minutes. The process used an oxidizing improver, so ascorbic acid is the main one we use, and then it includes fat as an essential part of it, and some other adjustments to the sort of recipes that would be used normally. You can see at the top right a quote there, and Nikki mentioned this as well, that the process has become very popular in the UK and in some other countries like Australia, New Zealand, and so on. Its benefits are, I've mentioned already, that it's faster and that it uses less floor space. Another key thing that has transformed the UK baking is that we used to import a lot of high protein wheats from North America, and this enables us to use a lot of our own homegrown wheats, which tend to be lower in protein. So that transition actually has happened maybe up till about the mid-1980s or so, and driven by a few things. So partly the CBP that can cope with our homegrown wheats, also the Plant Varieties and Seed Act giving royalties to our breeders, making it sort of incentivizing them to produce homegrown wheats. Joining the common market made overseas ones more expensive. And you can see on the right, the wheat yield has gone up. That is partly as a result of what I said, the Green Revolution and advances in breeding technology and the introduction of semi-dwarf wheats, which produce a higher yield. They're producing more grain and less stalk. And you can see that the lower graph, the huge increase in our UK wheat production. partly driven by that yield. Also, there was a switch from growing barley to wheat, which has been part of that trend. So thinking about recipes as well, and they of course vary a lot, but I've picked out of that report from the 60s an example of a recipe that was used then. You can see it's a fairly lean one, but there are some optional ingredients listed as well. And on the right, a more typical example from one we use in our pilot plant at Camden BRI with a lot more modern ingredients. Fat was optional previously. If you're doing the Chorleywood bread process, it's an essential part of the definition of that process. Fungal alpha amylase, I think, may have been available in the 60s, but malt flour was listed there, and we have got a lot wider range of enzymes used as well now. Potassium bromate was a very popular oxidizing improver, but that was banned in 1990. So we now have ascorbic acid as our main option that we use, and it requires air from the entrainment in the mixer to achieve its function, which I will come on to. And you also see datum there. It's an emulsifier. We did have emulsifiers before. I think glycerol monostearate is listed there and is one of them, but we have much wider use of those and innovations in these ingredients now. And Nikki also mentioned the trends in salts driven by dietary reasons. So there has been a reduction in that. You can see 1.5%. This is by flour mass. Translates to about 1% in the final product. So in terms of the ingredient innovations, and I'll try and go a bit quicker now to make up for the lost time, we do have a long list of new ingredients available to us, and I've just got a little bit of an illustration here of the effect of datum, which is one of the emulsifiers that is now popular. This is some images taken with an X-ray technique that we developed, and we see cross sections of freshly molded doughs. The ones at the bottom mixed with a Tweedy mixer, which is one of the types of the high-speed mixer we use for the Chorleywood bread process. And with the X-ray scanner, we can watch what happens as these doughs prove. The ones on the right have datum in them, not having much effect in the prover, but when we put it in the oven and watch what happens when it bakes, you get a lot more oven spring with the datum. So that emulsifier is having an effect in the oven. It's stabilizing bubbles, helping gas retention, and giving you a larger product, and typically a finer textured, softer product as well. So this is the sort of technologies available to us now. Another innovation, I say another innovation that has happened, driven by the banning of potassium bromate in 1990. I mentioned that ascorbic acid needs oxygen to work. Well, it's been known for a very long time that if you pull a partial vacuum in the mixer towards the end of the mixing process, you will get a finer structured bread. But of course, doing that makes less oxygen available. So a process that was patented by Bill Collins, again, my former colleague, was to use positive pressure, about 2 or 3 atmospheres in the mixer at the start to get the oxidizing effect working, and then to pull the vacuum at the end. And it needs a special mixer with the lid clamped on, because the vacuum, you don't have a vacuum holding it on all the time. You have a positive pressure early on. Also, as well as the bread making process, something I've seen myself is a lot of transformation in the methods available for us to characterize the quality of bread. So loaf volume, when I started, we did with seed displacement. You'd put a loaf in a box and you'd fill it up with seeds, and which packed to a known density, and you'd weigh them. Now we have laser scanning technology, and this is widespread in bakery laboratories. For texture, conveniently fits with about the 60-year period we're talking about. Elena Czesniak at General Foods came up with the method called texture profile analysis, which is based on compressing a product twice and measuring the force. And she applied it to lots of different foods and came up with a general method. Well, that has now become widespread, and there are commercial instruments available, and it's commonly used as the main method now for bread. So that's happened over that 60-year period. In terms of the structure of the bread. We used to look at it, press it, score it, and give it a human score, and we still do to some extent. But we also have instrumental methods available, and I was involved with development of C-cell, which is one of the widespread methods used for characterizing bread structure. And not just bread, but the ingredients. I could come up with a long list, but protein content is one to pick out. We used to use Keldol, which involved boiling concentrated sulfuric acid. We've replaced that as the reference method with DUMAR, which is a combustion method, and I think popular partly because it doesn't have all those hazardous chemicals. But also over this period, we've seen NIR come in as a rapid method, widespread through wheat and flour characterization and a lot of other food products. And it was back in the 1970s that Carl Norris in the States first developed that technology, and it's now used throughout laboratories and online for characterization of protein and other properties. So in conclusion, I think we've mentioned that one of the key things over 60 years has been the Chorleywood bread process, which is now the widespread method used for bread making in the UK. We've seen a transition partly driven by that and through other things to much more reliance on homegrown wheats. And we've seen new ingredients coming in, particularly including emulsifiers and a range of enzymes. We're now in a position where about 60 to 70% of our bread is white. 50% is sandwiches. I don't have all the historic figures, but I feel that's probably a trend that has happened nowadays. A lot of us are eating out and buying supermarket sandwiches and so on, which I think we probably didn't do 60 years ago. So thank you very much for your attention. I will stop sharing.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both very much. I certainly found it fascinating. And can I just encourage people who are listening in to jot questions down? You can put them into the Q&A, then I can pick those up and put them to our speakers. I guess I would like to start with one, and you both have slightly different reference figures, but either way, it looked to me like white bread consumption kind of decreased down to about the 2010s and then increased again. And yet, on the other hand, we quite often hear quite a lot of negative press about white bread. And I just wonder, maybe starting with you, Nikki, why do you think it's kind of come back up again?
There are a couple of reasons, and interestingly, COVID might well be one of them, in that during lockdown, there were fewer types of bread available. And also we find, particularly when there's any sort of economic hardship, and we've gone through some real hard financial times, a lot of people go back to white bread. It's like a number of reasons, an ultimate comfort food. Sometimes it's also where the price promotions are. So yeah, it's an interesting trend, but we've definitely seen that little sort of kick back up again, coming back into the sort of white bread consumption. And there are a number of people who, no matter what they read in the press, say, I like my white bread. There's nothing actually wrong with it. And if I want to be healthy, I'll put some lovely healthy fillings with it, and carry on enjoying what I enjoy.
Fair enough. I think I'd probably fall into that camp, if I'm honest. Martin, do you have anything to add on that?
I don't know exactly why the trend, but I think that white bread has always been a popular part of the mix. And yet I suspect a lot of the marketing, and for those in the industry, all the innovations and things are, can we put seeds in it and pulses and things? And we have to remember that it has been 50% or so of the market for ages. And even if the sorts of sectors we move in, like a range of different styles, there are lots of people who are trying to feed their family, and their kids perhaps object to things with bits in them, and so it's still a very large and perhaps under-recognized part of the market. It's stayed there, and probably also driven by some of the sandwich trends that I mentioned. Although of course we use different styles in those, but
and actually, just
I think we did a. Sorry,
carry on.
We did do a little bit of work looking at how people use bread. And we've, I think I mentioned in passing that some of the enzymes we now use have given us an extension in shelf life. And a lot of people, when they've just got their bread fresh, maybe they've got it sort of baked in store and it's warm and so on, they like to have sort of white bread like that. But over time, they may use it in a bread pudding or something. So as it starts to stale, people still use it in other ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, right. Questions are absolutely flooding in if I'm looking slightly distracted. But if we just stay with health, maybe for the moment. So there's a question around folic acid, and I guess we could broaden that out more to the fortification of flour more broadly, because obviously we already have 4 fortificants in there. I suppose, what is the bakery industry's response to fortification? And indeed, are you ready to add that folic acid that we've been waiting for about, what, 20 years, Nikki?
Yeah, absolutely. We are ready and eager to do so. There's so much good evidence about folic acid fortification. I think as an industry, our view has been it shouldn't be our decision. We're not the health experts. We wait for government guidance, and that has come through. So the only thing left to sort out now is the labelling. Because it goes into white flour, it goes into so many products. So literally all we're trying to sort out now is the transition of getting all those labels changed in one go. But it's fairly straightforward for us to do. So yeah, we're all sort of ready, willing and able.
And actually, just picking up on part of your answer from the last one, Martin, there's a question here, sort of just more broadly about shelf life and how that might have changed over the years.
Well, I think it's got longer, and there are sort of two aspects of shelf life. One is the staling process, and the bread getting firm and hard. And it's not necessarily loss of moisture; it is retrogradation of the starch. And some of the maltogenic enzymes that are used have helped extend that an awful lot. And then the other aspect is if it goes mouldy, and there are sort of anti-mold agents that can be put on. It's more of an issue in warm climates and so on. Hasn't been so much of an issue in the UK.
Sadly. And then there's a question here about kind of, again, more broadly on health, but touching on celiacs and how we I guess how we react to wheat. And there was kind of quite a lot of concern, I'm sure many on the call remember this, around probably like early 2000s about celiac disease. Was that increasing? And then kind of, and I don't know if you've got views on that, Nikki, but linked to it, I think probably for you, Martin, then, that there was quite a lot going on in the bakery industry, thinking about, you know, how could they respond to that? And specifically here, the person mentions partially fermented flours that could be a response to that. And they were just wondering if that, you know, had continued, or has that something that's been looked at or happened? So Nikki, maybe you first on kind of the rise of concern.
I think, you know, there became a lot more awareness of celiac disease, which is only a good thing, because, you know, it is such an issue. If you have it, you have to avoid gluten. You can't be having a little bit and it's okay. However, there are other people who I think have a sensitivity rather than a full-on celiac disease. So there are people who maybe find certain breads suit them better than others. The partially fermented starches and things hasn't really taken off. Obviously, there was a bit about FODMAP's diet at one stage, which was more about thinking about the starches in the flour and how they break down. So it's more gone down that route than fermenting to resolve that.
And have you anything further on that one, Martin?
I'm probably not the expert on it. We do have allergens experts here,
yeah,
and so on. And also experts on the labelling of these sorts of things. And I remember from a talk one of them gave recently that they sort of say it's not actually there are proteins in the gluten to which some people are allergic, but in terms of the listed allergens, it's not actually gluten that is the one. It's cereals containing gluten is the one that we have to declare.
Yeah. And actually, I'm just going to throw slightly off piece because I'm interested in this one. So it's not a question. Someone else has come in. But you were talking, Martin, about one of the benefits of Chorleywood was that we could buy more homegrown wheat and use
Yeah.
that because of the lower protein quality. And then also the green revolution then happened, and so we started to grow different grains and varieties. Is British grain though still lower in protein, or has some of that breeding revolution kind of brought the protein contents up?
Typically, if you want the really high proteins, it's North America is the place you go to for them. And British wheat, we import a lot of Europe. If we have a poor harvest, it will tend to be Europe we go to get similar types of wheat. North American wheats are different in character and do tend to have higher protein. But as I say, we don't need that high protein nowadays for most bread production. There will still, we're still importing North American wheats for some specialist requirements. And notably Warburton's as our biggest bread baker, they use Canadian wheat. But yes, it's been for quite a while over 80% homegrown, and lower protein is one of the aspects. Protein quality, there's been huge developments in that, and we keep seeing new varieties coming onto the recommended list all the time with improvements in the baking performance and the gluten, but the protein content still we don't get those high levels, but we don't need them. There are also downward pressures to say, well, actually putting a lot of nitrogen fertilizer on the field is not good environmentally, so we would prefer to be able to use low protein wheats if we can.
And maybe that's a good time to pick up on sustainability then, actually. There is a question in the Q&A about kind of future sustainable production. Nikki, you touched on it in terms of, what you see as the big things coming down the line, and of course across the food industry, hitting various different environmental goals is a huge task for us over the next few decades. So yeah, what is your view in terms of how bread making can move towards being more sustainable, and what are your key challenges in that?
I think, Martin mentioned about nitrogen fertilizers, and generally the way that we grow our wheat, and the millers and the bakers are good friends, and we spend a lot of time talking to each other. We do need to work in partnership and understand how we do this. We have got to change the way we grow wheat in this country to be more sustainable. There's a lot of stuff about regenerative agriculture, min-till, so not ploughing so much, watching how much fertilizer we use. And there's so much clever technology now to look at, sort of aerial drones looking at what needs to be added where, so that we're precision fertilizing and the protein quality that we get to. And there is lots of good stuff going on out there, actually. There are good projects. They're small scale at the moment, but farmers are really engaged in this discussion. And it's interesting that as you see farmers talk to each other, and learn from each other, I just think it will become the norm that these good practices will come through. But the things we're learning are that there's no one size fits all solution. We have different soil types even across the UK and different conditions. So we have to find what works for each area. But it's really exciting and really interesting area.
And would you see that as a big challenge looking forward, Martin?
It's one of the current ones. I mean, we've been talking about 60 years of baking, and if we think what's going to happen over the next 60 years, there may be huge changes that are going to be very difficult to foresee. But as a current thing, sustainability is a hot one, and use of nitrogen fertilizer is part of it. Partly because it's produced by the Harbour process, and that's a big generator. It uses a lot of energy as a generator of carbon dioxide. Partly, I think, because partly because there is concern that some of the nitrogen that's applied runs off the field and into watercourses and so on. So there are nitrate vulnerable zones. So that's been a pressure for a while. And also because it's an expensive thing for farmers to use. Perhaps partly driven by increases in energy prices recently. So that's perhaps one of the current focuses on the sustainability.
And then I'll probably have to break this down.
Just another thought. Nikki was mentioning there's lots of interesting research going on. So part of it is projects to develop new wheat varieties that will produce lots of protein in the grain with less nitrogen applied, and it's basically, you know, you get it from there. But if more of it is going into the grain and into than elsewhere in the plants, and if it's uptaking it more efficiently, that's part of the drive. We're also doing a project looking at what you might be able to do in the bakery to use lower protein wheats and still make good bread. And
presumably energy is an issue here as well, given obviously baking requires heat. Is that a challenge you're also looking at in terms of that sustainability agenda?
I think we need probably UK-wide solutions on this. I think anybody processing knows that we have to find a solution for gas. So yeah, we're definitely an area we're watching very closely.
Okay, so there's, as you might expect, there's quite a lot of questions on either UPF or sourdough. I'm going to try and smush them into two in the interest of time. So to the people who've asked the questions, apologies if I don't quite get the angle you wanted on this, but if maybe we start with UPF, you mentioned it, Nikki. Obviously there's quite a lot of certainly a media narrative on this, but it, you know, I think it is, as you said, it's fair to say it is broader than that. We know there's ongoing research as well. So do you, I suppose, do you see that as a threat? Is that something that industry should be worrying about? And how should we be, as industry, how should we be responding to that?
I think if you look at the NOVA definition, it's so widespread, it's quite hard for consumers and people working in food to get your heads around. You know, if you're a large company, whatever you make will be UPF almost by definition. So we have to kind of come down a level. We have to follow the evidence and find out what is it that is causing the issue. And then when we know that, then we know what to fix. I think a lot of consumers are hearing the UPF narrative. I don't know how many are directly applying it to bread, despite the fact it's sort of being held up as the poster child of UPF. So I think their heads are still going towards ready meals and foods like that, the foods that they've traditionally associated as having a concern. But from what we're understanding, you know, we do need the evidence to follow, because otherwise we are just sort of shooting in the dark and potentially doing the wrong thing. So it's about trying to find that, and then we know how to react.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think we certainly
knew that would happen.
Sorry, we were talking off camera about how Nikki had to wave occasionally to keep her lights on. Such is the glamorous work of being in the food industry. So yeah, I would agree with what you were saying on that, Nikki. And of course, it's something, I mean, across the board, companies are looking at really carefully and thinking about. And at the moment, certainly a lot of the evidence is from observational studies. So yes, you know, you can draw those correlations, but actually what is happening is quite unclear. And so trying to kind of take that then a level down and say, okay, is there something here that is outside of what we already know from nutritional factors? So whether that's too much salt and sugar or too little fiber and fruit and veg, is there then an additional thing that we should be considering within our dietary guidelines? I think is kind of the stage it needs to get to, because at the moment, when SAC and the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition looked at that, and it actually just re-looked at it recently in its open meeting, which was 2 or 3 weeks ago now, they concluded that the evidence was still weak, and so it wasn't there to put into our dietary guidelines yet. And so I think, in common with Nikki, certainly what we're finding across companies is that at the moment, yes, of course, we're incredibly interested if this evidence base develops, but as it stands, the things we should be focusing on still are reducing salt, increasing fiber, and increasing fruit and veg. I mean, as part of that narrative, Martin, emulsifiers quite often come in, particularly with regard to bread, I would say, actually, but across the board. And I just wondered if there's any, are there concerns kind of in your world about the use of emulsifiers within something like the bread making process?
It's not something I've come across, and I mean, I think within our member interest groups and so on, the term UPF comes up a lot. I wonder whether it's actually caught the public imagination or attention yet, but within the industry, we're kind of waiting to see, whether it just goes away or whether this continues to be an issue. Yeah, we don't really get concerns over emulsifiers specifically. I mean, I think our members of the bakery industry are very keen to use them. They're useful. They give good functionality in bread. And what we're doing is trying to help people use them effectively.
And I mean, you did touch on this in your talk, but maybe could you expand a little bit on the purpose of the emulsifier within the bread making process?
It's largely stabilizing the bubble structure. I've done a lot of work on understanding how the bubble structure is formed and how pressures in the mixer and so on relate to what you get in the bread. And it's sort of over the last 30 years or so that we've had the measurement techniques available to understand what's going on. So the issue really is you're trying to incorporate a suitable number of bubbles into the dough when you mix it, and actually what we've discovered is that using the partial vacuum reduces the number and means that fewer of them will coalesce during the proving process. You also, but having made those bubbles that will a nuclei and will expand during the proof and baking process, you don't want them coalescing, bursting. So you need the walls to have the right extensibility and strength, and part of that comes from the gluten, and that's why gluten is sort of unique in being able to make good bread, and that's what a lot of so much the protein content, but the protein quality is doing, is getting the right properties that will retain gas. And the emulsifiers are adding to that. Fats tend to be sitting at the surface of the bubbles, and it's a further stabilization mechanism.
And I'm going to have to say, sadly, this is our last question because, as I said, there's a lot in the chat. Also, lots of complimentary things about your presentations. You'll be pleased to know. Everyone's found it fascinating, as have I. I think the last question, again, I'm going to amalgamate a couple here, but really around sourdough, I think, which is a bit of a lead on. Quite often, this kind of gets linked into UPF in terms of what should we be eating, I suppose. So it was a couple of questions around, do we think it's worth researching more? Are there health benefits of sourdough that maybe haven't been understood properly, and should we be looking at that? And then slightly existential one, possibly for you, Martin. Does sourdough mean the end of Chorleywood process here in the UK? Do you want to kick off with health benefits, and do we need more research there, Nikki?
Yeah, I mean, I always like to remember that sourdough starts with the same basic ingredients that your standard sliced loaf starts with. So your main ingredient is wheat flour. And it does make me smile when I see articles in the press saying, oh dear, don't eat refined white flour, have a lovely sourdough. And I think, but it's made with refined white flour. What are you missing? However, I mean, that fermentation period is interesting. And I think it is interesting to see whether there's anything within that. We're all very interested in fermented foods and gut health. So yeah, I think further research on that aspect would be really interesting. I know previous research has looked at things like vitamin and mineral content, and there's been no difference. So yeah, I think it's more the gut health side of things that would be really interesting to follow up.
Yeah, I agree. And it's such a sort of nascent area, isn't it, to look at all of that. And, just an easy question here, Martin, then. So, is that the end of Chorleywood, or what is the future of that process?
I think it's got a healthy future. There are always, I like lots of different styles of bread, and I encourage it. And there are people out there who are advocating for particular types. But actually, I think diversity of types of bread and good choice in the market is great. And despite all the innovations that come in and the current trend for sourdough, and there've been, seeded loaves and ciabattas and things in the past, that sliced white loaf still remains a large part of the market and always has done. So I think there's as a place, and the Chorleywood bread process, it comes in for criticism of making some of those really cheap budget loaves that people sort of think are not quite good quality, although they still sell. There's people who like them. But actually, the process itself can be used to make a wide variety of breads. It enables you to make cheap bread if you want to, but you can also make very high quality breads of all sorts of styles.
Perfect. Excellent. I mean, yeah, I have to say, despite being a nutritionist and eating a wide variety of bread, you can't beat slice of white butter and bacon on certain mornings. So with that glimpse into my personal life, I will draw it to a close. It just remains for me to thank Nikki Glett and Martin Whitworth for really fascinating tour de force across the last 60 years in bread making. Thank you all for attending the webinar today. I'm really sorry if we didn't get to all of your questions. It was great to have so many. Our speaker details will be circulated as we send out the recording. So if you are desperate to follow up on something, they are happy for you to do so. We are sharing the recording of the webinar with all of you who have attended today, and that will include this Q&A session. And it will go online on the IFST webinar hub, which is www.ifst.org webinars. Before you log off, you will see a little survey pops up after the webinar ends. If you can just spend a couple of minutes filling that out, that would be great. When we talk about putting on these events in the special interest group, it's really helpful for us to know if you find this format interesting or what topics you might want us to cover in the future. And so with that, thank you once again to Martin and Nikki and to all of you, and goodbye.